So yeah, very nice to have everybody here. My name is Kihara-Hunt at the University of Tokyo. This is part of the Hernan Cruz seminar series that University of Tokyo Research Center for Sustainable Peace does with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And this one is particularly dedicated to promoting business for human rights in Myanmar and learning lessons from Japan. We have our own former researcher who was associated with our research center, Mr. Sam Baron, who made a report on the business respect for human rights with regard to Myanmar. So this seminar is based on that report. So I would like to invite, first of all, our co-organizer, United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Chief of the Development and Economic and Social Rights Branch, Mr. Todd Howland, to have opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Professor Kihara. And I want to also thank the University of Tokyo, the panelists and the participants for joining us today. It was 75 years ago today that the drafters of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights were completing their work. And in recognition of the fact that a Chilean diplomat named Hernan Santa Cruz was really instrumental in inserting economic, social, cultural rights within the Universal Declaration and putting it and creating an understanding that all rights are interrelated, we decided to create a dialogue series in his honor. And this, of course, is part of that. But one of the other reasons why we decided to honor the legacy of Hernan Santa Cruz was because oftentimes when we learn about the Declaration, we're very much focused on World War II, the atrocities of the genocide, but we forget that it was also written in the context of widespread economic distress, and that the purpose of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was to create a world free of fear and free of want. And so for us, it's very important in the 75th year to rekindle the letter and spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just to quote one particular part of the preamble, the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society keeping this declaration constantly in mind. For us, that is extremely important because the idea of human rights, the original concept found in the Universal Declaration, is that human rights are to provide policy guardrails for all activities in society. They are to provide useful solutions to difficult questions. But what we found in the last 75 years is that often in the economic sphere, whether that's economic policy, whether that's investment decisions, whether that's business models and activity, whether that's consumer choice, human rights isn't considered. It's not considered as it should be. So we're very happy to be part of this particular Hernan Santa Cruz dialogue. I want to spend just 2 minutes talking about the human rights economy, a concept that we're pushing at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to reassert the importance of human rights within the economy. There's 13 pathways, and I'll be very short. First, governments and investors, businesses, consumers began treating economic, social, and cultural rights as part of the rule of law. Governments start to use human rights as guardrails for and measures of success of fiscal policies. Governments start using progressive taxation, income, and wealth, and cooperate to end illegal financial flows to create more fiscal space. All stakeholders begin to see tax avoidance and corruption as undermining government obligations to maximize available resources to invest in economic, social, and cultural rights. Recognition of the source of discrimination and inequalities through the acceptance of policies and decisions, businesses begin to interpret their fiduciary duty to maximizing returns while respecting the human rights of others. This is an important change for businesses and regulators. Investors begin to change their practices to ensure that their investments are human rights enhancing and at least do no harm. Enhancing levels of respect for human rights becomes part of industrial policies. A new paradigm develops where we understand that the care and support systems are anchored in investments to create inclusive and dynamic societies. Economic growth can be counted on not just to show economic activity, but also to understand the human rights costs of that activity and creating a roadmap so that costs are not imposed on those not in the transaction. The success of societies should be based on the level of respect for human rights of all the people in its jurisdiction. It is very important that people begin to take their own obligations seriously, whether as a part of business or as individual consumers, to understand that their actions have ramifications on others. It's also critical at this particular junction of limited fiscal space that creditors begin to accept human rights obligations as rule of law, that debtor countries can ring-fence investments in economic, social, and cultural rights. Of course, for this session, it is very important. The idea that investors and businesses need to understand the potential human rights costs of their activity. We feel that this will be an extremely interesting discussion, focusing on the importance of business to enhance human rights in difficult contexts, but also to avoid imposing costs on others that aren't in their transaction. So I wish you very well in this discussion, and thank you very much for your participation. Back to you, Professor Kihara.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Todd, for opening remarks that is setting the baseline for this seminar. And now I would like to invite Mr. Romain Caillaud, the director of SIPA partners, to moderate the panel, moderate the rest of the session. Romain, please.
Thank you, I. And I will actually immediately hand over to our main speaker, who is Sam Barron. Sam is a researcher at the Research Center for Sustainable Peace at the University of Tokyo and the author of a report on business and human rights and Japan in Myanmar. So over to you, Sam. You have up to 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Romain, and to the University of Tokyo, and to UN-OHCHR, our partner, and for all the panelists and audience members here today for tuning in this webinar. Let me just briefly share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. So the theme of today's kind of webinar is kind of focused on my report about Japanese business activities in Myanmar after the military coup. To provide a bit of historical context, Myanmar for about 60, 70 years was under dictatorship. And starting in 2010, 2011, the economy started to open. A lot of foreign investors started coming in, and particularly there's a lot of Japanese investors who were interested in the Myanmar economy because the government of Japan and the government of Myanmar had longstanding political ties going back many decades, in which the Japanese government gave overseas development assistance and a lot of other loans and kind of infrastructure assistance to the Myanmar government, even during periods of military rule. And so in 2011, the Japanese External Trade Organization and a lot of other Japanese actors kind of gave money to the new pseudo-civilian government in Myanmar to establish a special economic zone and kind of pave the way for a lot of Japanese companies, especially big multinationals, to kind of enter the economy at that time. Following this, in June 2011, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were officially adopted by the UN General Assembly. And these were basically international standards kind of governing responsible business conduct that were formulated by John Ruggie, who was appointed by the UN Secretary General to look at the issue of transnational corporations and business activity and human rights. And so from this point on, about in 2015, Myanmar held another election, and this kind of paved the way for a more civilian government, which the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, who were the biggest political party in Myanmar, were allowed to rule the country. And then in 2016, the US government officially lifted sanctions against Myanmar, and this kind of opened up a lot of investment into the Myanmar economy. And during this time, especially after US sanctions were lifted, there's really big investment from a lot of Japanese companies. And I think around fall of 2020, Japan actually became the second largest investor in the economy after China. Kind of moving on to the broader kind of business and human rights trends. Not shortly, but a few years before the coup occurred, the Myanmar military, under the civilian government of Aung San Suu Kyi, kind of committed ethnic cleansing. Some UN agencies have called it a genocide, basically forcing hundreds of thousands of refugees from the northwest part of Myanmar into Bangladesh. Allegations of war crimes and other crimes against humanity being committed in that context. And it kind of raised an alarm to a lot of businesses that perhaps we shouldn't be doing business with this military force that is committing all these atrocities. And so there's a kind of a movement within civil society, especially from an activist group called Justice for Myanmar, that kind of shone a spotlight on a lot of the business ties between a lot of these big multinational companies that had entered the Myanmar economy during this kind of reopening period, and the military junta. And then in 2019, especially, OHCHR released a report, the UN Fact-Finding Mission, on the economic interests of the military, kind of shining a spotlight on some of these links between the military, which their formal subsidiaries are Myanmar Economic Corporation and then Myanmar Economics Holdings Limited. So to kind of assess the broader trends of the military coup, which made it very, very difficult for a lot of companies operating within the economy to do business, first of all, and second of all, respect the human rights of the people on the ground, because the military was actively cracking down on civilian protesters. There's reports of abuse in a lot of factories that employed a lot of Myanmar workers. And so my report kind of focused on three kind of pivotal questions to kind of assess how Japanese companies were looking at these set of issues. The first question, how did the coup impact the decision-making processes of companies? Are Japanese companies invested in the economy, which was considered high risk, aware of the UNGPs and other international standards on responsible business conduct, like OECD multinational guidelines? And then how did the military coup impact how these companies actually adopted new policies related to business and human rights? A few notes was that this survey was conducted a few months ago, so between January and February of this year. And we reached out to 390 Japanese companies that were on the Japan-Myanmar Chamber of Commerce's list, and about 55 of them responded. Looking at what companies actually responded, the vast majority had over 250 employees. And the first question we asked them was, over the next year, does your company plan to expand, retain your current operations, or curtail or kind of lead the economy? And the majority of Japanese companies said that they plan to retain their operations, and about the other half said they would either actually expand their operations or attempt to cut down, temporarily suspend their operations, or perhaps initiate an exit from the economy. This survey aligns with official survey data from the Japanese government themselves, who earlier, I think in December of 2021, conducted a similar survey and found that 70% of firms plan to keep or expand their operations, which is essentially roughly in line with what our survey found. The next question we kind of asked was, since February 2021, political conditions of Myanmar have deteriorated. What would you say that these conditions have made it more difficult for your company to operate? And the vast majority, over 80%, said that, of course, the coup made it challenging given the operational context and the kind of human rights challenges inherent to that. But interestingly, among the companies that answered yes, that it made it more challenging, we also asked them, did it make it more challenging to respect the human rights of your workers or the local population? And surprisingly, only less than 20%, around 15% of Japanese companies felt that this was the case, despite the situation kind of on the ground after the coup. And so another kind of key question that was asked was among these companies was, have you heard of the corporate practice known as corporate human rights due diligence? And about 60% of companies said that they hadn't. But if you ask them, we asked them right after this question, have you heard of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights? Around 60% said yes. But for people who are unaware, human rights due diligence is a kind of key component of the UNGP's Pillar 2 of those principles. And so it kind of reveals perhaps a lack of awareness among a lot of these companies still in the economy about what human rights due diligence procedures are and kind of how to execute them. This was a finding that was also found by Tom Andrews, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. When he visited Japan in April of this year, he talked to a number of different Japanese companies and said that kind of the main issue kind of impacting a lot of these investments were that when the Japanese companies first entered the economy, that they hadn't conducted this human rights due diligence, and they weren't really aware of kind of the human rights implications of their business operations. And so this kind of contrasts from a lot of Western or American companies. The State Department specifically, when the Myanmar economy opened, they instituted a set of reporting requirements so that allowed them to kind of track the progress on human rights and democratic reform, which is kind of the opposite of what the Japanese government did at that time. Another question on the survey was kind of, has the political situation in Myanmar prompted your company to adopt new measures to address the human rights impacts of kind of your investments on the ground? And this was kind of split 50-50. Half of them said yes, half of them said no. But the vast majority of companies that said yes said that they had now instituted new human rights due diligence policies, and then various others implemented or revised their human rights policy, or they decided to either leave the economy or kind of scale back or temporarily suspend some of their operations and factories, given kind of the labor abuses that may be taking place following the military coup. The views of some Japanese companies, especially that were kind of expanding into Myanmar at that time. So this is the president of Honeys, which is kind of like a garment manufacturing company in Myanmar, said that because that the company underwent social auditing, there's a lot of issues with social auditing, especially in the business and human rights context that I won't get into right now. But he basically said that we add to the economy by adding jobs, and that perhaps we don't actually need to be doing human rights due diligence. And then as part of the report, I also interviewed the CEO of a Japanese SME that entered the Myanmar economy back in 2015. He didn't retain any knowledge of kind of UN standards on responsible business conduct, even in this context in Myanmar, but he did join the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business statement that condemned the coup, and then also actively tried to cut ties with any military-backed companies like Myanmar Economic Corporation or Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited that his or his suppliers may have been in contact with. But despite the worsening business environment for this particular company, he said that he has no future plans to exit the Myanmar economy, and said that he felt kind of a responsibility to his employees and workers on the ground, and that perhaps maybe a responsible exit would do more harm than good in terms of realizing the rights of his employees. this is kind of a broad heat map of a lot of the Japanese companies that either temporarily suspended their operations following the coup, decided to eventually exit, or actually expanded. The vast majority of companies actually, so a lot of, especially auto manufacturers, temporarily suspended operation in their factories, and then kind of a couple years or after the coup, they resumed those operations because they felt that they still needed to employ Myanmar workers, and their line of business was still profitable. But then for a lot of the Japanese companies that exited, these were actually targeted by Justice for Myanmar or some of the activist groups that were implicated in kind of these military-backed conglomerates, with the exceptions, I think, of Uniqlo and Muji, which is a subsidiary of Uniqlo, that were concerned about labor rights abuses in their factories. So a brief word, since we're talking about kind of business human rights in the Japanese context, is that companies under the UNGPs kind of, if there's a situation of armed conflict, UNGP 7 and UNGP 17 say that this should be heightened human rights due diligence, and that this due diligence varies in complexity depending on the size of the business enterprise, the risk of the impacts, and the nature of the operations. And shortly after the coup, Surya Deva, who was then vice chair of the UN Working Group on Business Human Rights, said that companies should be actively looking to implement heightened human rights due diligence, especially in the Myanmar context, given the severity of human rights abuses that have the prevalence of taking place in that particular operating context. Next, specifically talking about the Japanese context, kind of what the Japanese government is doing to address this kind of lack of awareness or lack of knowledge among multinationals about UNGPs and kind of responsible business conduct writ large, is that last year in September of 2022, the Japanese government, mostly the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, helped issue guidelines for a lot of large companies and smaller ones as well on how to respect human rights in responsible supply chains. And this was a broader part of the government's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which is basically kind of a policy framework that helps the Japanese government articulate how it wants to work with the private sector to kind of eliminate or mitigate a lot of these adverse human rights impacts. And this is kind of the text that's used. Last note I want to make, especially for Japanese companies, is that there are certain human rights that have been negatively impacted by the coup, but then there's also human rights that could be potentially impacted by a company leaving the economy. These include, for freedom of association, the right to life killings, right to privacy. Certain companies following the coup had to turn over sensitive data to the military, right to collective bargaining. Union rights have been decimated following the military coup. But then for companies that kind of are facing this dilemma of whether or not to leave, kind of Myanmar faces this dilemma of kind of how do they realize its right to development, the right to work and workers, how do average people gain the right to an adequate standard of living, housing, or food, if there's no employment opportunities the private sector kind of gives to them. And so where exactly do we strike this balance between political rights and economic, social, cultural rights, especially in such a challenging context as Myanmar in the post-coup environment? And so kind of key takeaways: Japanese companies not very on board with human rights due diligence. They didn't, pre-transaction, didn't do any of this stuff. A lot of SMEs, especially, not just multinationals, do need capacity building to kind of get up to speed and kind of realize what the impacts they're having in such a sensitive context, and especially committing to doing a heightened human rights due diligence, given the operational concerns, and then kind of maybe changing mindsets about kind of the human rights impacts of companies, and because the survey found that they were concerned about kind of their operational bottom line, but not necessarily the human rights impacts of those operations. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Romain. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And I'm quite surprised by the last takeaway, the contrast. That's quite surprising. But thank you. And we are almost on time still. And now I'm going to hand over to Professor Surya Deva, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. And over to you, Surya. You have 5 minutes for your remarks. And one last thing, sorry, before you start, to our audience, please feel free to input your questions in the Q&A box. And we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the session to seek to answer those questions. So over to you, Surya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romain, and thank you for the invitation. So in the interest of time, I will just focus on two aspects. I will build on what Sam presented in terms of human rights due diligence and how it should look like in a situation of conflict, this concept of heightened human rights due diligence. And then I will talk about going beyond human rights due diligence, or the challenges or the complexities that are created even in normal situations, but of course, in a situation of complexity like Myanmar or any conflict situations. So in the interest of everyone, human rights due diligence is a process and businesses are expected to conduct it on an ongoing basis. It is very different from corporate or commercial due diligence that companies do. And I think one key difference is that consultation with affected stakeholders or potentially affected stakeholders is a key component of it. And if businesses are not able to do that for whatever reasons, it could be that the civic space is not there, or it could be that the civil society is having the fear of some reprisals if they will collaborate in the due diligence process. And this is going to become a real challenge for businesses to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts of their business activities. I think although this is merely a process, it also applies to the exit situations. So if a company is not merely deciding to enter a market, let us say Myanmar, it has to conduct due diligence before entering. It has to conduct due diligence during the process when it is there. And of course, if it decides to withdraw from a market at any point of time, it has to conduct human rights due diligence as well. The heightened concept of due diligence is relevant in the situation of conflict because you are not merely looking at the adverse impact on human rights, but you're also looking at the impact of your presence or your withdrawal on the conflict, how this is going to change the dynamics. And the context of Myanmar, of course, it is the support to the military junta and all that is going to be quite relevant. But let me conclude with 4 points. And some of these are tentative ideas, but 4 points for your consideration, everyone here. First is, I feel that in the BHR field, perhaps we are expecting companies to do too much. Because in a situation like Myanmar, the real challenge is that the state is failing to uphold human rights. And I increasingly feel that whenever Pillar 1 fails completely, Pillar 2 also is going to fail miserably. And I think we cannot expect businesses to replace the states. That's my first point. And of course, there are wider systemic issues in terms of the business models. And in my view, we need to think of new business models. I think Todd was talking about the human rights economy. And I think we should start thinking about those wider paradigms that are going to fix or address the root causes of the conflicts or situations that we're dealing with. The second point is, are we relying too much on human rights due diligence? And I believe we are obsessed. This is an important idea, good starting point, but I think we should not become obsessed that human rights due diligence is going to fix everything. It cannot. It has serious limitations, in my view, especially in a situation like Myanmar, where you can't really effectively conduct human rights due diligence. And I think that's where I believe that the idea of drawing certain red lines becomes quite crucial. The idea of challenging the business models which are inherently irresponsible, that issue becomes relevant. The third point I have is that should we make a distinction between the types of products and services a company is providing in a situation like Myanmar? For instance, a company may be providing garment, let us say you garment manufacturing, but all the garment manufacturing is exported, let us say outside Myanmar. That is one type of business. Second is selling ice creams. Third could be providing water and electricity, essential basic services. Should we be making a distinction in terms of those companies who are providing those basic essential services, and others who may be indulging in luxury, let's say resorts and all this. So I think that is the third point I have. And my last point is about leverage. We talk about leverage, and often it's a difficult question that you may not have the leverage if you withdraw from the market. But I will suggest that sometimes you may never have the leverage if you operate in a market. And sometimes the leverage you may have is by withdrawing from the market and you try to influence it from the outside. Because if you do not have any possibility of positively influencing the human rights situation on the ground, businesses need to ask this question, that do they really have the leverage? Can they have that leverage in the next 5 years or 4 years? And if they don't get the right answer, then I think they need to seriously think about their business models and what they need to do and how they can enhance their leverage by withdrawing from the market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Surya. Very good, all very good points. Now I will hand over to Dr. Htwe Thein, who is an assistant professor at Curtis University.
Hello, hi. Thanks very much. My part flows from Professor Deva's part in kind of arguments for and against staying versus going. So to address the debate as to, you know, should we stay or should we go? First, I'm gonna pick up from Sam's slide on where to strike the balance. So we have rights are being very much impacted by the coup, but by leaving, corporate exits has also affected the economic, social, and cultural rights. So where to strike the balance? So by staying, what we mean is by staying and conducting due diligence. So whether the due diligence, HRDD, is possible or not. So there are 3 reports recently. ETI report said HRDD is nearly impossible to implement. And Business and Human Rights Resource Center report said, this is a lot of wage deduction, wage theft, unfair dismissal, inhumane work rights, and often unpaid overtime, attacks on government workers' civil liberties. And recently, ILO report also outlined, and report calls for the military authorities to cease all forms of violence, torture, and other inhumane treatment against leaders and members of the trade union. So in these reports have come up and showed quite systematically these rights abuses. So where HRDD processes are very much impacted, of course. But those who are staying would argue quite rightly for we are providing a job. But then the question is whether is that a decent job, decent work. Pays are incredibly low, no grievance mechanisms, union leaders in prison, no stakeholders, civil societies groups under severe threat. Stakeholders consultation is near impossible, and lots of martial law zones, reporting requirements from the factories to the military monthly, I believe. Also in government, there's a problem with you can't say you're not contributing to the military's finances because you are totally reliant on logistics inside the country, and all the logistics are owned by the military or military-affiliated companies. And also, the funds coming in and going out is quite a lot of them now. So they have to use the official exchange rates that's of course directly contributing to the military. Also, MNEs have their own human rights commitments, all these, on the websites that you have broadcast. How about that? also you have to look at it. Is it still consistent? If this red line is drawn, then you exit, and you exit responsibly. So how to exit responsibly? The guidelines are vague and quite difficult to follow. So then sectors are very, different sectors have different kind of, importance and requirement. Say, for example, telecommunication sectors, we can refer to the exit of Telenor. Activists don't want Telenor to exit, but Telenor's argument is we have responsibility to exit. Then you have this responsibility to exit versus responsible exit. I'm referring to Professor Kristen Stokes of Oslo's discussions I have with him. Manufacturing of garment is debatable. I'm going to discuss that. So when companies exit, they tend to exit, quite fast. The timing issues without worrying about HRDD, and all they want is get rid of the activists off our backs, and then we will leave without worrying about the consequences. That is irresponsible business. But if it is staying, then you have to also think about what's your impact on future impact. Is that the situation in the country is getting worse? So this is dangerous for your assets and for your employees. Beyond human rights, you have to also think that these international guidelines are getting tighter and tighter as well. Most of all, you have to also think about, you have to respect the will of the people, diaspora outside Myanmar, and inside Myanmar, there are the young of the country that's still fighting. And therefore, this fight, this resistance, revolution is sustained, and you have to respect their will as well. And significant number of people are still on CDM, in fact, have to respect their will as well. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Htwe. And last, I'll hand over to Karina Ufert, who is the CEO of EuroCham Myanmar and based in Yangon. So over to you, Karina, for your 5 minutes, and then we'll move to questions. We have already 2 questions. So
Excellent.
to the audience, please feel free to continue adding in your questions.
Thank you, Romain, and thank you all of the fellow speakers. I mean, indeed, it's excellent discussion, and it's also very relevant for us, the European Chamber, because of course we are in the same ecosystem as businesses, and the challenges which in the overall landscape which Sam outlined excellently in the previous slides is to a large extent comparable to the European sentiment, because indeed about the European Chamber of Commerce, we are 156 European companies present in Myanmar, and I would say most of these companies are large multinationals, and indeed we don't take the situation as business as usual. I would like to emphasize this, and we put the practice where the words are, and in that sense, I would like to highlight also on the chamber side the importance of due diligence of our members. So I can confirm that none of our members have any direct links to the military. There are no sectors in question involved in our membership, and also we provide certain thought leadership to our membership in terms of emphasizing the must of the human rights due diligence in the operations. There's been also interesting discussion on the possibility or the impossibility of human rights due diligence, and I would like to come in on this because this is the area where we think the chamber adds the most added value to the members. And of course, I would like to also invite the Japanese counterparts to further explore this in the future sessions. So I also think it's important to demystify the concept of human rights due diligence, and indeed it was already emphasized. It's a lot about risks and it's a lot about leverage. So I think by being on the ground, and that's what I like to emphasize myself and the team is on the ground, and we also encourage our members and the company representatives to either have presence on the ground or frequently visit the operations and engage with the local partners and suppliers, we understand the context. And certainly there is also openness to engage with stakeholders. We have open dialogue going with one of the trade union federations. We work with the local chamber of commerce. We engage with the local CSOs, especially those providing the opportunities for the unemployed workers. So there is a certain concept of the living reality of the people on the ground. And it kind of guides us in our motivation to see how we can exercise our leverage in terms of indeed exploiting the avenues where we have certain weight. And that translates into very practical examples. For example, it's engaging with the, let's say, with the suppliers, manufacturers, in terms of emphasizing the importance of the freedom association, importance of the unions or the workplace committees being able to present and raise their issues and grievances, and also an effective engagement of the factories in these processes. And I would say, even going back to the business human rights report, and which was already mentioned in the previous speech, if you go through the track, it's also possible to see the responses of the companies. And also from our side, we're engaged now in the program called Made in Myanmar. So it also will provide information to the outside, to the stakeholders, about the effective engagement of the brands in terms of solving the grievances and improving the work situation. Also, from the chamber, we find important to indeed provide the fact-based information and to enable the due diligence, because indeed one of the matters is that Myanmar context is extremely complex in terms of the beneficial ownership, in terms of any touch points to the military. So another example of our practical support to the companies is the government sector fact sheet, where indeed we mapped out the potential linkages in terms of the factory ownership, in terms of the land ownership, and of course the logistics, because we represent over 10 European logistic companies which are present in the country, and indeed they have no use or no linkages to the military infrastructure. We also managed to go quite in depth in terms of the export earnings and then the other tax allocations. I'll copy the link to the fact sheet, and also next week you can expect the extended version. But this is just to emphasize, I think, we are driven by the very thorough understanding, and it was also emphasized here a couple of times, that whatever decision, staying or going, it's ultimately the company's decision, and it needs to be based on facts and considerations, engaging with stakeholders. But it's also about having the jobs and livelihoods at stake, and the European companies employ around 500,000 people, so we're not taking this lightly. So in that sense, I'd say the importance of heightened due diligence is a must. We do think it's possible, and also from the chamber side, we stand ready to support our companies, but then also see how we can engage with the Japanese companies in making this operationally possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. Yes, indeed, I mean, there are a number of Japanese participants in the audience, and I'm sure they'll be happy to. You'll be happy if they reach out to you to seek to engage with EuroCham. So you can find Karina's email address on the EuroCham website, or you can reach out there if needed. So maybe now let's move to the Q&A session. We have about 15 minutes or a bit less than that, actually. And I'd like to share two questions. I'll address each question. We have two questions, really, and I'll address each question to two of you. So the first question, I think, is about the ability of policy advocacy towards a regime like the State Administrative Council by companies in Myanmar. And because we talk about the leverage of companies on their supply chain, their suppliers, etc., but to use the question put forward by Svetlana, or the comment put forward by Svetlana, which talks about government functions and their lobbying teams, etc. In a context like Myanmar, is it possible? And are there examples of policy advocacy being undertaken by companies, whether foreign or domestic, towards the military regime, and so not beyond the private sphere, towards the military regime, that have positive outcomes for the human rights of workers and the broader population? And I'd like to address this question first to Karina, because I think you'll be likely well placed to answer that, but as well to Surya. Because Surya, you mentioned, and very rightly so, that when Pillar 1 so the duty of the state to protect human rights fails, it's very difficult for companies to abide by Pillar 2, which is the duty of companies to respect human rights. So and this is why a context like that of Myanmar is so difficult for companies to operate, and that's why heightened human rights due diligence is required. So if I may, that's the first question, and I'll address it first to Karina and after to Surya. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you, Sam. I think it's oh, sorry, Romain. It's an interesting question, and indeed, again, back to what I mentioned about the leverage. EuroCham Myanmar is in no contact with the SAC, so we don't have any formal policy contacts. This was decision by the board and it was communicated accordingly. But we are in strong and very close collaboration with the local Chamber of Commerce, the UNOHCHR, as well as the Myanmar Garment Manufacturing Association. So, for example, again, one of the examples refers to the arrest of the garment workers following the strike and then the attempt to organize a trade union in the Hosheng case, and we immediately raised it with the local Chamber of Commerce. We emphasized that this is not the way how we see industry developing, and if this is happening and that basically happened and this is continuing to happen, this will be a red line for businesses, right? So that we were very clear to the local chamber, also putting certain arguments with regards to the impact of any decision of the companies disengage of the impact on the employees, on the systems, and so on. And I mean, we managed to prompt the interesting discussion with the association, and also an internal letter from the association to the factory members, emphasizing the importance of the Freedom Association of respect to the workers raising their concerns, and also the same letter and the same communication later on followed from the Ministry of Labor. So of course, then it's a question of, this is the regulation, the question of implementation. But that's also, it's way more complex, because often it also requires engagement with the factory management in terms of understanding the role of the workers in that sense. So this is where, again, we come in with the MATE program, which effectively trains the factory management on really understanding and respecting the workers' rights. It's not universal. I'm not saying that every single factory, and there are over 800 factories in Myanmar, that they all follow the suit. But again, we are focusing on the export-oriented factories, and again, this is where the link with the Japanese manufacturers is key for us to gain this common understanding. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good question, but a complex question, and I see a potential positive role for lobbying on the part of businesses to promote human rights. Often lobbying is associated to undermine human rights. But it can also be used in a positive way by businesses and chambers of commerce to promote human rights. Whether this could happen in a complex environment like Myanmar or many countries which are authoritarian regimes in Asia or elsewhere, I have my doubts. You can do positive lobbying selectively about a soft human rights issue. But the UN guiding principles are expecting you to respect all human rights, not just one that you like or one that are feasible in a given context. And I believe that it is not easy, not possible to change the regime practices on those particular issues. And Myanmar is not a big economy. There are other bigger economies in Asia where we have serious challenges in terms of human rights. And I have my doubts that businesses can pursue that lobbying positively to bring a change beyond a point. And that goes back to my point that the systemic challenges that we are facing in the world are such that we need to recover the state. And the states have serious deficits in terms of democratic values, in terms of their commitment to human rights. And as we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of human rights, I think we need to also push states to realize their role in that debate.
Thank you, Surya. And Karina. So now let's move to the second question, which had been received in writing prior to today's seminar. And I'll address it to Htwe and also to Sam. And the question was, what areas, what types of human rights risks in Myanmar should Japanese companies especially pay attention to? So I think based on your experience and knowledge, both of you, for Japanese company operating in Myanmar, what are the key issues in terms of negative human rights impacts that they should be concerned about and undertaking due diligence on? Would you like to start, Htwe?
Yes, so first of all, their own reputational risk. Not to mention their assets and employees and their own reputation, that what they have, that the frameworks, the signatories to all this framework that they have committed to, and are they in breach of it? When the state is the perpetrator of human rights, can't protect, then the ground is very loose. So they are very open then to their reputations being damaged. And if they don't do proper HRDD, then what they can be seen as business as usual, which a lot of the companies are, but they don't know what it is. They don't do really proper diligence, then business as usual. And that is not acceptable, because, all this, violence and all this change has happened, and businesses continue as business as usual. So that's not good. Thank you.
Thanks, Romain. I guess to build upon on that, I think in the Japanese context, I think it's important to kind of consider that for a long time that there was this kind of, to address the question on lobbying, this association in Japan that had retained ties to the military government, specifically Yohei Sasakawa, Watanabe, and a few other people essentially kind of cozied up with the regime prior to the military coup. And then post-military coup, a lot of the companies that were a part of that association that were essentially trying to bring investment and more economic growth to Myanmar then left that association because of the reputational damage that they faced. So I think one key example was Mitsubishi. Right after the coup, they left. A few other smaller Japanese MNEs also said that they avowedly condemned the coup. They rejected it, and they wanted nothing to do kind of with the military in charge. And so kind of for Japanese companies, I think, especially for a lot of these big MNEs, the kind of entered partnerships with the government kind of before the coup is kind of disassociating themselves from these conglomerates and these entities that have ties, and even subsidiaries of these then conglomerates that they may or may not be aware of have ties to the military. And then I think the other point I wanted to mention is on the tax component. So I think a big dilemma that is facing a lot of Japanese companies right now is whether it's acceptable or necessary to be paying certain taxes to the SAC, because the National Unity Government, which is the shadow government, the parallel government that was formed primarily of former NLD lawmakers, has suggested that a lot of companies place these tax revenues into an escrow account, and that they be given to the legitimate government of Myanmar, and whether paying these taxes are kind of legitimating the regime or having a worse human rights impact on the local population. So I think those are two kind of key points that I would highlight.
Thanks, Sam. And I'll mention that on the topic of tax payment to the military regime, Sam, together with Burmese Myanmar author Ye Kang-woo, recently published a paper exactly on this topic with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. And actually, the ICS is preparing a number of other articles and papers on the economy and Myanmar. So please watch that space. And also check out Sam's paper on the tax issue. That's quite relevant. So we have one last question, which comes from Tepe Kasai here in Tokyo with Human Rights Watch Japan. And the first part of the first, actually it's two questions. The first question is about business and human rights in Japan, and what is the view, our views, what are our views on whether Japan should make guidelines on human rights due diligence that were recently published by METI last year, as shown by Sam, whether these guidelines should be made legally binding, or there should be a separate legislation on BHR. And then the second question is on, I think, Yodogawa and the bridge in Thein connecting Thein and Yangon, which is reportedly seeing funds being transferred to MEC, military-owned company. And what can civil society organizations do to seek to have this project suspended, or I assume payments to MEC stop? So maybe we don't have much time. So maybe I'll ask Surya to comment on the first question about Japan, but also beyond Japan. What about human rights due diligence legislation, and you have the CSDDD in the EU, etc. What should Japan do? What should other countries do? And then if you have time, we'll stick to address the second question. Thanks.
Thank you, Romain. Very briefly, human rights are not optional. They are not voluntary. They're not voluntary for states. They're not voluntary for companies, in my view. So mandatory due diligence legislation is the way forward. And I hope that countries in Asia, including Japan, starts moving in this particular direction. We also, in fact, right now have a discussion going on in the Human Rights Council in Geneva about negotiating a legally binding instrument that will create a human rights due diligence regime globally. So I hope countries not only enact the national laws, they also support the treaty process in Geneva, because that's where we can create global rules, not rules merely for European companies, but rules for the global companies everywhere. I will stop with that. Thank you. Or did you want me to address the second question as well? No, I believe. Maybe my
no, only one question.
Panelists can address.
No, but I mean, thank you. No, I'll ask that second question to Htwe, and to conclude with your view on how CSOs and other organizations can act.
Well, CSOs, so it counts for both inside and outside Myanmar. So in Japan, so that's where CSOs should be more, should be louder, should be more pressuring. They should pressure to their companies, because companies don't act on their own, sadly. And you have to have, like we call it, home country, where your headquarters, so in this case would be Japanese CSOs, will have to pressure their own multinational enterprises to do the right thing.
Thank you, Htwe. And maybe I'll mention also that, and you surely know that, Tepe, that there is the OECD's national contact point in Tokyo. So that's maybe one avenue to explore. But we are close to the end of the hour. So thank you to our speakers, including Sam for your presentation, and Surya, Htwe, and Karina for taking the time. And I'll hand back to I for quick closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that we have such a small time spot. Yeah, thank you very much. It was really very, very interesting. There are many elements. We talked about leverage, we talked about decent jobs, we talked about will of the people, domestifying human rights due diligence, livelihood, state deficit with business and human rights, tax. I mean, there are so many things that we can follow up with, and I think everybody who is here are very interested in looking at the Japanese the lessons further. So we'll be committed to working with you on these issues. I just want to close this with a thank you note to our partner, UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We thank very much for all the panelists. This is so luxurious to have all of you, including our own can I claim, Mr. Sam Baron, for this fantastic report. And then we would also like to mention, thank you very much for all the partners and our staff at the Research Center for Sustainable Peace for always hosting these interesting seminars. And then lastly, if I may take this opportunity to announce that we also have the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights visiting us from 5:30 to 7 o'clock Japan time to the University of Tokyo Komaba campus. So if you are interested, please have a look at our Research Center for Sustainable Peace's website. So thank you again very much for all the distinguished panelists and everybody who's attending here. Thank you very much.